What would it look like to have a conversation with the other side? To communicate with people who have crossed over and are no longer among the living? During the 1840s, a huge religious movement began rooted in the belief that that idea is, in fact, possible, and that there are those amongst us who have the talents to relay messages from the dead to their living loved ones. Séances became the most popular form of party entertainment for the upper and middle classes. Mediums and psychics would perform on stage in grand theaters. And of course, with belief, this movement was also met with skepticism. And with those who have talent, there were those who were frauds and attempting to profit off of grief. At the heart of it all were Leah, Margaret or Maggie, and Kate Fox, sisters who were amongst the first to create a strong belief and the first who truly disturbed the movement.
Welcome to Down the Crooked Path. I'm your host, Amanda Joy. Join me as we dive into eerie and spine-chilling stories that blur the lines between reality and the unknown, from cryptids and mysterious disappearances to true crime, UFO sightings, and paranormal activity. Venture into the unknown and uncover the secrets that lie down the crooked path.
Today, we journey through the story of the Fox sisters, powerful mediums who would, at first, convert the strongest disbelievers, to later stir the greatest of doubt, and finally to attempt a revival. With so much confusion surrounding them, it's hard to say whether or not they were the real deal, or just some young girls who hoodwinked thousands. During the early 19th century, the Spiritualism movement rose to popularity in English-speaking countries and stemmed from the philosophy that, through mediums, departed souls could communicate with the living. Although intriguing, the idea of communicating with the dead wasn't a new one. For centuries, cultures and religions had held fast beliefs that life beyond death existed. Furthermore, early mysticism influenced the spiritualism ideals that the spirits of the deceased are privileged to information that the living isn't. Spirits were generally regarded as more advanced. Even the Bible refers to man speaking with angels. The movement, although having declined in the 1920s, has had a long-lasting effect on society. It demanded advocacy for certain changes in societal traditions, such as religious freedom and feminism, as most of its leaders of spiritualism were in fact women. Many believe two young sisters and their interactions with a ghostly entity referred to as Mr. Splitfoot are responsible for the start of it all. Maggie and Kate Fox were the youngest of 6 children born to Margaret and John Fox, a Methodist farmer. In December of 1847, their parents moved into a rented house in Hydesville, New York. The house was small, with 1 bedroom shared by the girls and their parents with 2 beds. In March of the following year, odd noises and knocking started to plague the family. Despite all attempts, no one could locate the cause of the noises. The rapping and noises were so consistent, happening nightly and causing the family to lose sleep. Then one evening, as the rapping started like usual, Kate sat up in bed and imitated the noise by snapping her fingers. Whatever it was that was causing the noises seemed to respond. Maggie tried next, saying, "Do as I do," and the rapping repeated the same number of raps that she had made. Then Margaret asked for 10 more knocks, and from somewhere within the house, 10 knocks answered back. Over the course of the next few evenings, the girls began to converse more in depth with this entity, and did so more elaborately. They instructed the noises to make 2 sounds if the answer was yes, and so forth. Eventually, they had come up with an entire alphabet system. The girls came to call this spirit Mr. Splitfoot. It should be noticed that Splitfoot is also a reference to the devil being cloven hoof. Splitfoot claimed that he was a peddler named Charles B. Rosa, who was murdered by the previous tenant of the home, a man named John C. Bell, and that his body was buried in the basement. To prove to their mother that this entity was real, they taught her how to communicate with it. She asked her age, and the entity replied with the correct amount of rappings. By this point, word had spread about the mysterious rapping-like activity, and neighbors quickly came to see for themselves. More than 500 neighbors and townfolks visited to lay witness to the otherworldly communications between the young girls and the ghost peddler. The girls would huddle on the bed together and ask questions to the spirit as the neighbors looked on and listened to the unsettling correspondence. To prove the story true, everyone decided to dig up the basement and find the remains of the murdered peddler. Unfortunately, their efforts were stalled when they ran into groundwater and feared the basement would flood. This dig proved no answers. A few days later, they tried again. This time, they unearthed what could have been fragments of bone or skull remnants and what looked like portions of hair. After this, O'Leary, Mr. and Mrs. Fox decided to send the young girls to live with their older sister, Leah, in Rochester. Once the girls left home, the rappings and hauntings seemed to leave with them. Leah was the oldest of the Fox children, with a string of failed marriages. As you can imagine, she was initially skeptical, having read the letter sent by their mother. It seemed as if the girls were playing a prank on their parents. Leah had become intrigued by the idea of communicating with the dead nonetheless. At the time, Leah was an admirer of Emanuel Swedenborg, a Swedish mystic and theologian who claimed to have visions of the spiritual world and could communicate with angels. He had described the afterlife of having 3 heavens and 3 hells, and in between those, a world of spirits. This is where one goes once you first pass away, and it's here that a spirit can communicate with the living. He apparently had visions of a new religious movement that would change the established religious authorities and traditions through communications with the afterlife. His ideas were popular among radical Quakers and reformers in Rochester, and Leah saw her sister's abilities as confirmation of Swedenborg's writings. Let's take a second to look at Franz Mesmer, a German physician and astronomer who played a significant role in the development of spiritualism. He became popular in the late 18th century for his theory of animal magnetism, which claimed that a natural energy flowed between all living and non-living things. He used his hands and magnets to manipulate this energy and heal his patients, who often experienced convulsive fits or trances during his treatment. His theory of animal magnetism also provided a scientific explanation for the phenomenon of spirit communication, which appealed to many people who sought rationality and evidence for their beliefs. Mesmer's legacy is still evident today in the field of hypnosis, psychology, and parapsychology. Mesmer's influence also reached America, where some of his disciples established magnetic societies and performed public demonstrations. One of them was Charles Poyen, a Frenchman who arrived in New England in 1836. He lectured on animal magnetism and mesmerized many people, including the Fox sisters, during the height of their popularity. Swedenborg and Mesmer walked, so the Fox sisters could run. Now by this point, the knockings and rappings had become associated with the young girls, and being in an area where people were more exposed to the ideas of the supernatural with the aid of folks like Mesmer, curiosity of these supernatural manifestations grew. After all, who wouldn't want to converse with a deceased loved one lost to sickness or war? To say hello or goodbye? Leah saw this as an opportunity and took the position as a stage manager of sorts. Suddenly, she too developed psychic abilities. She arranged for her sisters to perform both public and private events, charging high fees yet keeping most of the profits for herself. Growing in popularity, skeptics and supporters alike flocked to see the girls demonstrate their communications from beyond the grave. During these performances, not only could spectators hear the disembodied knockings and rappings on the tables and walls, spelling out coded messages, but audience members could feel the rappings transmitted through their bodies or were touched by invisible hands. Tables and chairs lifted by themselves into the air. Some claimed to see ghostly transparent hands or faces, even figures floating in the dark. All three sisters claimed that these were genuine demonstrations of the supernatural. But were the Fox sisters really in contact with the dead, or were they just clever tricksters? This is a question that has divided scholars and enthusiasts for over a century. Some members of the public saw the girls as sincere and viewed them as too young to be capable of such deceptions. But others were not that easily convinced. Much like Mesmer, the sisters had their fair share of supporters and critics alike. Mesmer's methods were controversial, and he was accused of plagiarism, fraud, and even immortality by some of his peers and authorities. The girls would use some of Mesmer's and Poyen's teaching to support their claims. They attributed their abilities to the magnetic influences of Poyen. Mesmer can be seen as a precursor of spiritualism, as he introduced a technique that could have induced altered states of consciousness and facilitated contact with the spirit world. Skeptics, though, found fault in these ideas. They claimed that the sounds, the knockings and rappings were not supernatural at all, but simply the result of the girls cracking their toe joints, ankles, and using mechanical devices. Tricks such as ventriloquism or hidden devices were used to produce the sound of bells, musical instruments, and disembodied voices. They were accused of using wires and magnets, maybe a string to move an object without touching them. Dr. E.P. Langsworthy was one such skeptic, wrote an article in 1851 titled "The Death Blow to Spiritualism," where he described how he supposedly detected wires and springs under the sisters' dresses. From doctors to journalists and magicians, many tried to expose them as frauds. The movement was disturbing the status quo of established religions such as Catholicism. The spiritualism movement contradicted the biblical teachings of the afterlife and capabilities of mere mortals. These actions were regarded by many as blasphemous. It was also a time of intellectual advancements as well. People were starting to grasp a more rational understanding of the world around them, and scientific ideas were flourishing. Skeptics wanted the girls proven as frauds, be it by science or be it by religious means. And so, the girls underwent tests and demonstrations, some demoralizing and humiliating, to prove their legitimacy. Leah often encouraged these events, eager to keep the flow of cash going, regardless of how degrading and traumatic these tests may be. Of course, the girls were also welcomed guests by others, eager to speak with long-gone loved ones, or to explore the realms of the afterlife. One particularly horrid trial, the girls had been brought to Buffalo University by a group of women who claimed to be interested in their spiritual abilities. But these women were actually sinister in their intentions. They wanted to test the sisters to see if they could really communicate with the dead. The sisters were separated and taken into different rooms, where they were stripped of their clothes and examined by the women. They were violated and humiliated, but really they had no choice. Then they were shackled in metal chairs, with wires attached to their limbs and heads. The women told them that they would send electrical shocks through their bodies if they detected any fraud or deceptions. It is said that the girls prayed silently during the onslaught of these assignments. They heard the women ask questions in the other rooms and then they tried to answer them with rappings. But the shocks came anyways. The women accused them of making the sounds with their joints, their teeth, or their feet. They said that they had found nothing supernatural in their bodies, only flesh and bone. The sisters endured this torture for hours until they lost consciousness. When they woke, they were lying on a cold floor covered with bruises and burns. They had failed the test. The women had found no evidence of spirits, only human suffering. Dr. Charles West was a renowned psychologist and skeptic who decided to investigate the claims of the Fox sisters. He invited them to his laboratory in 1851 and subjected them to a series of tests, hoping to expose them as frauds. However, he was astonished by what he found. First, he asked them to sit on a wooden platform that was connected to a device that measured vibrations. He then asked them to produce the raps while he observed a needle on the device. To his surprise, the needle didn't move at all, indicating that the raps were not caused by any physical movement of the sisters. He then asked the girls to stand on a glass plate that was insulated from the floor by rubber. He reasoned that if the rappings were caused by electricity, they would be interrupted by the glass. But again, the raps continued as before, seemingly defying any natural explanation. He then asked them to hold their arms and feet in the air while he examined their mouths and ears for any hidden devices. He found nothing. He also searched their clothes and hairs, but could find no evidence of trickery. Finally, he asked them to rap out the answers to some questions that only he knew, such as his mother's maiden name and his birthday. The raps spelled out the correct answers, leaving him speechless. Dr. West had to admit that he could not explain how the Fox sister produced the raps, or how they knew things that they should not have known. He wrote a report on his findings, stating that he had witnessed a phenomenon beyond the scope of science. He became a believer of the Spiritualism movement and a supporter of the sisters, who gained even more fame and followers after his endorsements. William Crookes was a prominent physicist who was interested in the phenomenon of spiritualism. He invited Kate to his home in London for a series of tests. He wanted to prove that the raps were not produced by any physical means, but by some unknown force. He asked Kate to sit in a chair with her feet off the ground and to place her hands on a table. He then placed a piece of paper under her feet and another one underneath the said table. He also attached electrodes to her limbs and connected them to a galvanometer, a device that measures electric currents. He observed that the raps occurred even when there was no contact between Kate and the paper, or between her and the table. He also noted that the raps were not affected by the electric currents in her body. He concluded that the raps were genuine, and that they were caused by a psychic force emanating from Kate. He wrote, "I have tested Miss Fox in every way that I could devise, until there had been no escape from the conviction that she really was the medium of an influence which produced sounds out of reach our senses." Despite this, his experiments were criticized by other scientists and skeptics, who accused him of being gullible and biased. They pointed out flaws in his methods, such as the lack of proper controls, or the possibility of fraud or deception, and the influences of his own beliefs on his observations. They suggested alternative explanations to rapping, such as cracking joints, ventriloquism, or hidden devices. Crookes defended his findings and claimed that he had ruled out all natural causes for the rappings. He also said that he had witnessed other phenomena with Kate, such as direct writing, levitation, and materialization of objects. He argued that these phenomena could not be explained by science, and that they required a new branch of knowledge. He wrote, "The phenomena I am prepared to attest are so extraordinary and so directly oppose the most firmly rooted articles of scientific belief that nothing short of personal experience could possibly enable me to realize their possibility. Harry Houdini, the famous magician and escape artist, was a fierce debunker of spiritualism. He had a personal reason for his crusade. He wanted to find a genuine medium who could contact his beloved mother. But he was disappointed by every medium he encountered and exposed their tricks and frauds to the public. One of his targets was the Fox sisters. Houdini said he learned that they used their toes and joints to make noises. He demonstrated this technique on stage. He also revealed that P.T. Barnum, a famous showman, had hired the sisters for his traveling show and coached them on how to fool audiences. He even went so far as offering $10,000 to anyone who could replicate the phenomenon under his conditions. Houdini's crusade against spiritualism put him at odds with one of his friends, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Doyle was a devout spiritualist who believed that his son, who had died during the First World War, had contacted him from the afterlife. He also believed that Houdini had supernatural powers and refused to accept that his feats were based on skill rather than science. Doyle tried to convince Houdini of the reality of spiritualism by arranging a séance with his wife, Lady Doyle, who claimed to be a medium. She produced a message from Houdini's mother, written in English and signed with a cross. But Houdini was not impressed. His mother was Jewish and spoke only German. He accused Lady Doyle of copying the message from a newspaper article about him. Houdini and Doyle's friendship deteriorated as they became more outspoken about their opposing views. Houdini wrote books and articles exposing the frauds of spiritualism and testified before Congress in support of a bill to ban fortune-telling in Washington, D.C. Doyle wrote books and articles promoting evidence of spiritualism. The two men never reconciled before Houdini's death in 1926. Houdini had promised his wife, Bess, that he would try and send her a coded message from beyond the grave if it was at all possible. But after 10 years of séances, each held on Halloween night, Bess gave up, saying that Houdini had not come through, and publicly declared spiritualism as a fraud. She later said that the only man who could have contacted her husband back was Conan Doyle, but he had died in 1930. First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln had a lifelong fascination with the occult. She was drawn to the mysterious and the unexplained, especially after the tragic deaths of her son Willie and her husband Abraham. She sought comfort and guidance from various mediums, but none more famous than the Fox sisters. She met the sisters in 1863 when they visited Washington to perform at the Smithsonian Institute. She was impressed by their abilities and invited them to the White House, where they held several sessions with her and the president prior to his death. The sisters claimed to have contacted the spirit of Willie Lincoln, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and other illustrious figures. Mary Todd became a loyal supporter of the sisters. She defended them until her own death in 1882, convinced that they had given her a glimpse of the afterlife. On November 14, 1849, the sisters demonstrated their abilities at the Corinthian Hall in Rochester. Not everyone was convinced of their abilities. A committee of skeptics led by Aleb W. Carpone, a newspaper editor and anti-slavery activist, decided to test the sisters and expose their fraud. They were invited to a private session at the home of Amy and Isaac Post, radical Quakers and family friends of the Fox family. There, the committee exposed the sisters to various tests, such as holding their hands, feet, ankles, knees together, tying them with ropes, placing them on pillows or feather beds, and making them stand on glass tumblers. They also asked them to rap in response to questions that only spirits could know. To their surprise, or maybe dismay, the committee found that the knockings continued under all of these conditions, and that all of the answers were often accurate and relevant. They concluded that the sisters were either genuine mediums or had some unknown physical abilities that produced the sound. They published their findings in a pamphlet titled, "A Report of the Mysterious Noises Heard in the House of Mr. John D. Fox in Hydesville, Arcadia, Wayne County, 1850, which became a bestseller and helped spread the popularity of spiritualism. Vigorous testing aside, one blight against the girls was the incident with the peddler, Mr. Splitfoot, or Charles Rosa, the sisters' first encounter with a spirit. Most historians agree that he most likely was made up by the girls. There is no record of a man named Charles Rosa or a John Bell, who was the supposed renter who murdered him, for that matter. While most tell the story of the peddler being hit in the head, the girls' story about how he died and what he looked like varied every time they told it. And the hair and bone fragments found in the basement, they were later proven to be from an animal and a wig. One could see how it might have been possible for the animal bones to be there before the family moved in, but the wig may be a stretch. Did the girls go into the basement and bury it there one night without being noticed by their parents? How did they get the bones or the wig without drawing attention? Did their parents plant it? Although they seem to be victims if it was a prank rather than a part of it. It all begs the question as to whether or not the peddler was real. While there is no record of the man the girls claimed responsible for the spirit, this was a time when record-keeping was subpar at best, so it is possible that records of either man were lost or not even made at all. The largest piece of damning evidence against them came from the sisters themselves, especially when Maggie did the unthinkable. She confessed it was all a ruse. Maggie Fott met Elijah Kent Kane, a famous Arctic adventurer, in 1852. The relationship faced many obstacles. Kane's family was religious and conservative, and they highly disapproved of Maggie's involvement with the spirits. They tried to keep the couple apart, but the lovers found ways to communicate through letters and clandestine meetings. Maggie even converted to Catholicism for Kane, with hopes of winning over his family's acceptance. But fate had other plans. Kane died in 1857, leaving Maggie heartbroken and alone. His relatives denied their marriage and claimed his estate, while Maggie struggled to prove her rights and honor his memory. She published their love letters in a book, The Love Life of Dr. Kane, but it only caused more controversy and scandal. She never gave up on her love, even when the world turned against her. While there is no concrete evidence of a marriage between Fox and Kane, it is believed by most historians that her relationship with Kane is most likely what led to her confession. On October 21st, 1888, she called a press conference at the New York Academy of Music. There, in front of a large and curious audience, she confessed everything. It had started off as a clever trick that they had devised as children to fool their superstitious mother. She came up with the idea to fool their mother into thinking that the house was haunted by spirits as an April Fool's parade. She told her younger sister, Kate, to join her in the scheme, and they had prepared a secret code to communicate with each other. They used an apple tied to a string, a loose floorboard, and their own toes to make mysterious knocking sounds in the dark. They also pretended to be scared and asked their mother for help. Maggie and Kate enjoyed the attention and the thrill of deceiving everyone. They never expected that their prank would become so popular, or that people would pay them to talk to spirits. They had carried on for so long because they felt that the prank had gone too far and there was no turning back. She demonstrated how she could produce the wrappings with her feet, and denounced spiritualism as a fraud, a delusion, and a sin. She said that she had been driven to confess by her conscience and her desire to warn others from being deceived. She also accused her sister, Leah, of being the mastermind behind the scheme and of exploiting her and Kate for money and fame. Kate was present during the announcement. She had agreed to be present as a witness, but she remained silent. Was she torn between loyalty to her sister or fear of losing her livelihood? She had been a medium for most of her life, and she had no other skills or prospects. Audience members reported that she looked pale and nervous, implied that she feared consequences of the revolution. She knew they would lose their followers, their income, and their reputation. She knew that they would face the wrath of their sister Leah, who was still a devout spiritualist and a successful medium. But she didn't dare speak up or contradict Maggie. Another question looms over the sisters. Was Maggie's confession honest and truthful, or had she just made a terrible mistake? Had she lied in hopes that she would be left alone, free to pursue a normal life? Perhaps instead of being relieved, she felt a deep sense of guilt and betrayal. She had denied the truth of her own experiences and those of her sisters, who shared the same gifts of mediumship. She had also disappointed and angered thousands of people who believed in her and sought her guidance. She had destroyed her own reputation and that of her sisters, who were now shunned and mocked by the press and public. And with that, Maggie decided to recant her confession. She wrote a letter to New York World explaining that she had been pressured and bribed by a reporter to make a false statement. She declared that she still believed in the reality of the spirit world and that she had never deceived anyone. She begged for forgiveness and understanding from her friends and supporters. But it was too late. She had already sealed her fate with her own words. Her recantation was met with disbelief and scorn. No one trusted her anymore. Her letter was dismissed as a desperate attempt to regain her fainted fortune. What was the truth? Had the girls been living a lie this whole time? Or was there something more to Maggie's confession? There was plenty of motivation for Maggie to fake confession. For one, she had a life of deception and exploitation orchestrated by Leah. The eldest sister had acted like the mastermind behind their career and manipulated and controlled the sisters, forcing them to perform and encouraged the humiliating trials that the girls underwent to perform their authenticity. She stole from them, taking large shares of their earning, leaving them in poverty. Maggie resented Leah for ruining her childhood and for driving a wedge between her and her lover Cain. Cain and his family were another influence. Cain had come from a devoutly Catholic upbringing and had attempted to persuade her into abandoning her practice when she married him. His family also pushed the matter, even after Cain's death. They refused to recognize her as his widow, and because of this, she wasn't entitled to any of his inheritance. Longing for love and acceptance from his family could have pursued her into making her announcement, especially considering she had converted to Catholicism to gain their approval. Some historians also believe it's possible his family threatened to expose her, while others will argue that the confession could have been a way for her to express her grief over his death. Maybe that she felt some sort of responsibility for what happened, and the confession was a way to reflect her remorse. Living in poverty, inheritance money was not the only financial persuasion for such a confession. There were those who believed that a media outlet such as a newspaper or a competitor medium had offered Maggie money to confess, regardless of that confession being fact or fiction. However, if this was the case, it didn't bring about the financial security Maggie had been hoping for. The decline of the spiritualism movement was a perfect storm of several factors. Maggie's confession did not help the situation, but many other frauds had arrived on the scene already. One of the most notorious frauds was a man named John Davenport, who pretended to be a medium and performed psychics with his brother Ira. They used hidden wires, magnets, and musical instruments to create the illusion of supernatural phenomena. They also hired accomplices to act as spirits and answer questions from the brothers. The Davenport brothers traveled across the US and Europe, making money and fame from their shows. However, much like the Fox sisters, they faced criticism and ridicule from skeptics, who eventually exposed their methods and challenged them to perform under controlled conditions. Another example of a fraud was a woman named Anna Eva Fay, who also claimed to be a medium and a psychic. She used sleight of hand, hypnosis, and ventriloquism to produce effects such as levitation, materialization, and mind reading. She also wore costumes and wigs to disguise herself as different spirits. She was very successful and influential in her career, and even performed for royalty and celebrities. However, she was also exposed by magicians and investigators, who revealed her secrets and accused her of exploiting people's beliefs. These frauds, among many others, contributed to the decline of the Spiritualism movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They damaged the credibility and reputation of genuine mediums, who were often accused of being imposters or deluded. They also disillusioned many people who had hoped to find comfort and evidence in the afterlife. They reiterated that spiritualism is not a reliable or scientific way of exploring the mysteries of life and death, but rather a source of entertainment and deception. And with the decline of the movement, what happened to the Fox sisters in later years was a tragic tale of betrayal, despair, and death. Both Maggie and Kate suffered from alcoholism and depression. Both had turbulent marriages and divorces. They resented Leah for her domineering and manipulative behavior. After Maggie's confession, the two sisters were at odds with each other. Kate felt like she had left their community down, and their reputation had been destroyed. With that came even more poverty. The sisters had become estranged, and their relationship never recovered. The sisters died in poverty and obscurity within 5 years of the confession. Leah, who had disowned her sisters after the confession, died in 1890 at the age of 77. Her cause of death has gone unknown, but many suspect untreated diabetes or Bright's disease, a kidney disorder. Leah married 3 times, having 3 children with her first husband, a man named Fish. Her second husband, a man named Calvin Brown, died in 1853. And her final husband was a fellow spiritualist, Daniel Underhill. She was the only one who died wealthy and respected by the spiritualist community. Leah maintained their sincerity up until her death, and on her tombstone was inscribed, "The Spirit's Friend." Kate died in 1892. Her cause of death was listed as inflammation of the brain, which could have meant several things, but most likely a brain tumor. She was 55 years old when she died. She had become an alcoholic, wandering from place to place, seeking solace in a bottle. Her death was barely noticed by the public. She was buried alongside Leah in Cypress Hills Cemetery. Prior to her death, she had been married to Hiram Lyon, a lawyer and fellow spiritualist. He divorced her on grounds of adultery. She remarried to a barrister and spiritualist, David D. Jenkins, who died in 1881, leaving her with 2 sons. Maggie, shunned by both believers and the skeptics, spent her last years in poverty and obscurity, relying on the charity of strangers. She followed Kate's death a year later in 1893, which was listed as heart's disease and dropsy, an older term for edema or swelling of the body. She and Kate supposedly had 2 children, both of whom died during infancy. The story of the Fox sisters is one of intrigue, mystery, and controversy. It is a story that challenges our notion of reality, truth, and faith. Not only have they left behind a legacy, but a mystery that still haunts us today. Were they genuine mediums who communicated with the dead, or clever frauds who exploited the gullible and the grieving? The evidence is not conclusive, and both sides have their supporters and their detractors. But what is undeniable is that their lives were tragic, filled with pain, betrayal, addiction, and poverty. They died young and alone and disgraced. Their story is a cautionary tale of what can happen when money and fame and power corrupts the human spirit. But it is also a fascinating glimpse into a time where people were hungry for answers beyond the material world and willing to believe in the extraordinary. The Fox sisters may have been deceivers, but they were also prisoners of a new kind of religion that still has followers today. Their voices may have been silenced, but their rappings still echo the halls of history. As the journey down the Fox sisters' crooked path comes to the end, thank you for exploring the unknown with me. Let these mysteries guide your next steps as you continue to seek out truths and untold stories around you. Until next time, this is Amanda Joy, signing off.